Then it really hit me. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all. I was frustrated.
6 kilometers from the lunar module, on a ridge in the Descartes Highlands where Earth had completely vanished below the horizon, Apollo 16 astronaut Charles Duke stopped the rover, raised his visor, and stared at a geometric formation in the crater wall that his geology training told him was physically impossible. Houston went silent for 30 seconds. When the response finally came through his headset, Mission Control did not ask him to describe it, did not ask him to photograph it, and did not ask him to approach it. They told him to continue with planned sample collection and move to the next waypoint. No curiosity, no follow-up, just a flat instruction to move on, delivered in the same measured tone used to confirm fuel readings. Duke followed the order, and then he spent the next 40 years not talking about it. What he is saying now, at 89 years old, is not just the testimony of a man finally unburdening himself before he dies. It is the most credible first-hand account ever offered for why human beings have not set foot on the moon in more than half a century, and why the official explanation has never fully held together. Slow zoom on archival Apollo 16 footage. Duke and Commander John Young driving the lunar rover across the pale Descartes Highlands, Earth absent from the sky. Charles Moss Duke Jr. was born on October 3, 1935 in Charlotte, North Carolina. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis in 1957, then went on to earn a Master of Science degree in aeronautics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He flew as a fighter pilot and test pilot before NASA selected him as an astronaut in April 1966 as part of the 5th astronaut class. 19 men chosen from 351 applicants. He spent 6 years working inside the Apollo program before he ever got close to a launch pad. 6 years of simulations, training runs, and mission support roles that gave him a more complete picture of how NASA operated than almost anyone outside senior management. His first major public moment came on July 20, 1969, when he served as Capcom, the astronaut responsible for direct voice communication with the crew during the Apollo 11 landing. When Neil Armstrong touched down at Tranquility Base, it was Charles Duke's voice on that famous recording, cracking slightly as he said, "We copy you down, Eagle." That moment of barely contained emotion, captured in NASA audio and replayed millions of times since, is the clearest evidence of something people sometimes forget about Duke. He was not a bureaucrat. He was not a politician. He was a man who genuinely believed in what the program was doing. His selection as lunar module pilot for Apollo 16 came after years of that kind of meticulous, unglamorous commitment. Apollo 16 launched on April 16, 1972, carrying Duke, Mission Commander John Young, and Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly. Their destination was the Descartes Highlands, a rugged, elevated region of the lunar surface that NASA's geologists had spent years analyzing from orbit. The scientific rationale for choosing Descartes was specific and confidently stated. The region was believed to be the product of ancient volcanic activity, and scientists expected to find volcanic rock formations that would help establish a detailed timeline of the moon's geological history. It was a mission defined by precision. Every sampling location, every traverse route, every experiment deployment was mapped out months in advance. Duke and Young would spend 71 hours on the lunar surface, longer than any previous crew, and would cover more than 27 kilometers across the Descartes terrain in the lunar roving vehicle. They would deploy the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments package, collect 95.8 kilograms of rock and soil samples, and return with what NASA promised would be some of the most scientifically significant geological data ever gathered from another world. The official account of the mission, as it was presented to the public in April and May of 1972, was a success by every measure. Houston celebrated, the press corps covered it dutifully, and Apollo 16 was filed away as one of the clean, triumphant chapters in the space race story. That is the official version. What the surface samples actually revealed, and what Charles Duke and John Young encountered during those 71 hours, does not fit cleanly into that account. The first crack appeared in the geology itself. NASA's scientists had dispatched Duke and Young to Descartes specifically to collect volcanic basalt. The volcanic origin of the site was not a hypothesis, it was a conclusion drawn from orbital photography and spectral analysis. It was the foundational scientific assumption underpinning the entire mission. When Duke and Young began collecting samples and transmitting descriptions back to Earth, the geologists at Mission Control grew quiet in a way that was not publicly noted at the time, but that became, in the decades that followed, a subject of significant scientific debate. The samples were not volcanic basalt. They were impact breccia, fragmented rock fused together by the enormous heat and pressure of ancient meteorite impacts, some of it dating back more than 3.9 billion years. The terrain the mission had been built around, the entire scientific justification for going to that specific location on the moon, turned out to be wrong in its most basic assumption. Duke described the landscape in one of his transmissions back to Houston as a shattered, blindingly white surface, nothing like the dark fire rock the geology maps had predicted. NASA later acknowledged the error, attributing it to the limitations of orbital imaging technology. Scientists revised their models. The mission was still declared a success because the impact breccia samples were genuinely valuable. But the Descartes Highlands were not what NASA had told the public, or apparently even its own scientists. They were going to be. That geological surprise is documented. It is in the published science. Duke has discussed it in interviews. What he began discussing more carefully, and more recently, is what happened during the surface traverses themselves, specifically during the extended rover excursions that took him and Young several kilometers from the lunar module, and well beyond the range where an emergency return on foot would have been feasible. During one of those traverses, approximately 6 kilometers out from the lunar module and in a section of terrain where the angle of the ridge had brought them below the line of sight to Earth, Duke reportedly observed what he has described as a geometric formation near the rim of one of the craters they were scheduled to sample. According to Duke, the formation was angular, too regular in its dimensions, and did not correspond to any natural fracture pattern consistent with impact geology. He called it out to Young. According to what Duke has said in multiple interviews in the years since, Young confirmed he could see it too. What happened next is the part that Duke took 40 years to talk about publicly. Duke keyed his radio and described what he was seeing to Houston. The transmission went through. Mission Control received it. And then, by Duke's account, there was approximately 30 seconds of silence before the response came back. 30 seconds in the context of lunar communications is not a technical lag. The signal delay between Earth and the Moon is approximately 1.3 seconds each way. A 30-second gap means someone at Mission Control held the circuit before responding. When the response came, it was the instruction to continue to the next waypoint and proceed with planned sample collection. Duke has said in recent interviews that in his experience across years of NASA training and flight operations, you do not receive a 30-second gap before a routine guidance update. You receive it when someone is either consulting with a supervisor or deciding what not to say. Duke did not push back. He was a military-trained test pilot operating in a high-stakes, time-constrained environment where mission protocol was not a suggestion. He moved to the next waypoint. He collected his samples, he completed his surface EVAs and returned to the lunar module. He came home aboard the command module Casper on April 27, 1972, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean southeast of Christmas Island. He was 36 years old and he had walked on the moon, and then, by his own account, he began a long process of compartmentalizing something he did not yet have a framework for understanding. Duke left NASA in January 1975. He entered the private sector, ran a beer distributorship in Texas, went through a period of personal difficulty that he has spoken about openly in Christian testimony settings, a marriage under strain, a growing disconnection from the work and the fame that had defined his life. In 1978, he converted to Christianity, and that conversion became the primary lens through which he discussed his lunar experience for the next 3 decades. In interviews focused on his faith, Duke described the moon as a place that had given him a profound sense of both grandeur and smallness, the kind of perspective shift, he said, that made the rest of his life feel simultaneously more meaningful and more fragile. Those faith-based accounts are real, documented, and widely distributed, but they are not the complete account. Duke himself has indicated, in more recent settings and to more specific questions, that the spiritual dimension of his experience on the moon and the anomalous phenomena he encountered during those traverses are 2 separate things, and that he spent a long time using the first to avoid discussing the second. In a 2019 interview, Duke acknowledged that every astronaut who walked on the moon came back with experiences that did not match the sterile operational account that NASA published. He said, according to reporting on that interview, everyone had anomalies, different things for different missions, but nobody's experience matched what NASA told the public. He went on to say, "We all knew we could not talk about it. Not because NASA threatened us. We just knew." That last sentence is worth sitting with. Not because NASA threatened us. The silence, by Duke's account, was not imposed from outside. It was the product of an institutional culture in which Apollo astronauts, men who had been selected, in part, for their psychological stability and their ability to function without emotional disruption, understood without being told that their anomalous experiences were not part of the story NASA was telling. There were no signed agreements covering those specific experiences. There were no explicit directives. There was simply a shared understanding, built over years of operating inside an agency that controlled the narrative of the space program with considerable discipline, that certain observations were not going to be useful to report. Archival still of Duke at post-mission press conference, April 1972, composed, crew-cut, answering questions about rock samples with precise technical language. That institutional discipline becomes clearer when you look at the broader context of how NASA managed Apollo-era communications. The public was aware that astronauts sometimes had microphone communications cut, rerouted, or delayed during missions. Former NASA communications engineer Otto Binder wrote about unexplained transmission interruptions in the late 1960s and early 1970s, citing ham radio operators who allegedly picked up transmissions from Apollo astronauts, describing anomalous observations that did not appear in the released transcripts. Binder's claims are contested and cannot be independently verified, and they have circulated in fringe communities in ways that have made it easy to dismiss them. But they did not appear in a vacuum. They appeared in the context of a genuine institutional practice, confirmed by multiple former NASA employees in the decades since, of maintaining what internal documents from the period referred to as flight communication security, a protocol that gave mission control supervisors discretion over what portions of crew transmissions were made available to media and public monitoring. It is important to be precise here, and precise is exactly what this evidence demands. That protocol existed primarily to protect crew safety communications and proprietary technical data. It was not, as far as any released document confirms, designed specifically to suppress anomalous observations. But the existence of that discretionary layer means that when Duke says Houston received his transmission about the geometric formation and held the circuit before responding, that behavior was institutionally possible. It was within the established framework of how Apollo communications were managed. None of this means Duke saw what conspiracy theorists have spent 50 years insisting the Apollo astronauts saw. Duke himself has never used the word extraterrestrial. He has not claimed to have seen spacecraft or biological entities. What he has described, repeatedly and consistently across multiple interviews spanning more than a decade, is something more specific and in some ways more unsettling. A formation that did not fit the geology, a radio response that did not fit routine mission protocol, and a long institutional silence that did not fit an agency genuinely uninterested in what its astronauts had experienced. If you have never encountered any of this before, if this is the first time you are hearing the details behind Charles Duke's public testimony, hit subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of buried history we go deep on every single week. This channel exists for the questions that do not get asked at press conferences. The question of why we never went back to the moon is, on the surface, well answered. President Richard Nixon's Office of Management and Budget was cutting federal expenditures across the board by 1970. By mid-1970, the United States was spending roughly the entire $25 billion cost of the Apollo program every 3 months to wage war in Southeast Asia. NASA's annual budget had already fallen from a peak of just over $5 billion in fiscal year 1966 to approximately $3.7 billion in fiscal year 1970. Public interest in lunar missions had collapsed with unexpected speed after Apollo 11. Apollo 12 drew a fraction of the television audience that Apollo 11 had commanded. By the time of Apollo 14, the major networks were running the landing coverage as a brief segment between regular programming. On January 4, 1970, NASA canceled Apollo 20 to repurpose its Saturn V rocket for the Skylab space station. In September 1970, NASA cut Apollo 18 and Apollo 19 entirely. Apollo 17, which launched in December 1972, became the final mission, not because it was designed to be the last, but because everything planned after it had been stripped away by budget decisions made at the White House and ratified by a Congress that had lost its appetite for lunar exploration. That is a clean, documented, fully sourced account of why Apollo ended. It fits together coherently. Every piece of it is supported by budget records, congressional testimony, and NASA administrative documents. Case closed on paper. Except that budget pressure does not explain several things that have never been adequately addressed in the official record. It does not explain why, in the 53 years since Apollo 17, no human being, not from the United States, not from the Soviet Union, not from China, not from any of the other spacefaring nations that have developed significant independent launch capability, has returned to the lunar surface. The Soviet Union had a functioning lunar program in the early 1970s. They lost the race to land a human on the moon first, but they had the technical capability and the political motivation to land their own cosmonauts on the surface throughout the 1970s. They did not. Their lunar robotic program continued. Their crewed lunar ambitions did not. The Soviets, who had every geopolitical incentive to upstage an American achievement by planting their own flag on the moon, quietly abandoned the effort without a public explanation that has ever fully satisfied historians of the space race. China's lunar exploration program, formally initiated in 2004, has successfully landed robotic missions on the moon, including the Chang'e 4 mission that touched down on the far side in January 2019. China has stated publicly and repeatedly that crewed lunar landings are a stated goal of their space program. As of April 2026, no Chinese taikonauts have landed on the moon. NASA's Artemis program, intended to return American astronauts to the lunar surface, has faced repeated delays since its formal inception in the early 2020s. The return to the lunar surface, promised under multiple successive NASA administrators and multiple successive presidential administrations, has not happened. That collective global inability to return is something the budget and politics explanation does not fully account for. Budget pressures ease, political will recovers, technology advances, and yet the moon has remained unvisited by human beings for more than 5 decades in a way that does not quite track with the normal arc of scientific ambition. Duke's account, taken on its own, does not explain that collective absence either. He has not claimed to have been told the moon was permanently off limits. What he has said, in the most specific terms he has used in any public forum, is that what he and Young encountered in the Descartes Highlands in April 1972 was communicated to NASA leadership, not through his own report, but through the recorded transmissions that Mission Control received and that Duke believes were reviewed at levels above the mission flight directors. He has said he believes that what was in those recordings affected the internal conversation about the future of crewed lunar exploration in ways that have never been publicly documented. He cannot prove that. He has been explicit about the limits of what he knows versus what he observed versus what he infers. That precision, that careful distinction between observation and interpretation, is one of the reasons his account is taken seriously by people who have spent years studying the post-Apollo period. In the years following the end of Apollo, a small number of other Apollo astronauts made statements in various interview and testimony settings that, taken individually, could be explained as the natural mysticism of men who had experienced something genuinely transformative. Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 lunar module pilot, became the most publicly outspoken. Mitchell founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences in 1973 and spent decades arguing that the nature of consciousness itself was fundamentally different from what mainstream science acknowledged, a position he connected explicitly to his experience of the overview effect during the return journey from the moon. He also made more direct claims, stating in a 2008 interview with Kerrang Radio that he was 90% sure that many of the UFO sightings over the years have been real craft, and that NASA had been briefed on extraterrestrial contact. Mitchell's claims were firmly and publicly denied by NASA. His willingness to speculate well beyond his direct experience is a fair criticism of how he handled his post-Apollo public role. But Mitchell and Duke are not the same kind of witness. Duke has consistently stayed inside what he directly observed and directly experienced. When he says he saw a formation he could not explain and that Houston's response was anomalous, he is not extrapolating into a theory about alien civilizations. He is describing 2 specific events, in sequence, with the precision of a man who spent years operating in an environment where precise description was a survival skill. That discipline, that restraint, makes his account harder to dismiss than Mitchell's, and more credible than it initially appears. Side-by-side still of Duke in his Apollo suit on the lunar surface, and a recent photograph of Duke at 89, the same careful composure across 50 years. Alan Bean, the Apollo 12 lunar module pilot, had a different response to his lunar experience. Bean became a painter after leaving NASA, and he spent the rest of his life, he died in May 2018, trying to render the surface of the moon in oils with enough accuracy that people who had never been there could feel what it looked like to stand in that silence. He mixed actual lunar dust from the samples he carried back into some of his paintings. Bean said in 2013 that he believed there was something about the lunar environment that altered perception in ways that science had not yet fully mapped, not through anything supernatural, but through the combined effect of radiation exposure, altered sleep cycles in the 6-day transit, and the psychological weight of total isolation from everything earthborn in the human sensory experience. Bean was not claiming anomalous phenomena. He was proposing that what astronauts reported experiencing on the lunar surface was filtered through a perceptual system operating under conditions it had never been designed for. Bean's framework does not contradict Duke's account. It actually makes dismissing that account harder in a specific way. If the lunar environment genuinely alters human perception through documented physiological mechanisms, then two things become simultaneously true. The anomalous reports from Apollo astronauts cannot be accepted as straightforward objective observations, but they also cannot be dismissed as simple fabrication or confusion. They are the perceptual reports of highly trained, medically monitored human beings operating under extreme environmental conditions. The angular formation that Duke saw 6 kilometers from the lunar module in the wall of a crater in the Descartes Highlands may have been a natural geological feature that his trained eye read as geometric under conditions of extreme contrast and unfamiliar shadow angles. Or it may not have been. The honest position, and Duke has held it consistently, is that the exact nature of what he saw has never been resolved. What does not require any perceptual uncertainty to evaluate is the 30-second silence from mission control. That is a radio event. It either happened or it did not. Duke says it happened. There is no surviving unedited transcript that confirms or refutes it. The transcripts that NASA has released from Apollo 16 cover the mission's public communications in detail. They do not, by the agency's own acknowledgement, represent a complete record of every transmission and every internal decision made at mission control during the mission. The gap between what was recorded, what was archived, and what was eventually released to the public was a product of that era's document management practices. Duke's reading of that gap is that the delay was deliberate. NASA's official position is that the mission's communications were handled according to standard protocol. Both of those statements can be simultaneously true in ways that do not resolve the question of what filled those 30 seconds. By 1974, 2 years after Duke walked on the moon, internal NASA planning documents, some of which have since been declassified through Freedom of Information requests, were already framing the question of a lunar return primarily in terms of what could be justified scientifically and politically, rather than in terms of any continuing human presence goal. The language of those documents shifted in a way that historians of NASA policy have noted. The goal of establishing a permanent human presence on the moon, which had appeared in post-Apollo planning language as recently as 1971, had been largely replaced by the language of orbital infrastructure, the Space Shuttle program, and low Earth orbit operations. The moon had gone from being a destination to being a demonstration, something that had been accomplished, filed away, and superseded by new institutional priorities. Whether that shift was purely financial and political, or whether it was shaped in some way by what those missions actually found on the surface, is a question the documents alone cannot answer. Duke retired from the Air Force Reserve in 1976 with the rank of Brigadier General, after logging more than 4,000 hours of flight time across his military and NASA career. He was 36 years old when he walked on the moon. He was 40 when he left active service entirely. He spent the following decades in business, in Christian ministry. He founded the Duke Ministry for Christ organization and spent years doing lay witness work across the United States and internationally. And in the gradual, careful process of deciding how much of his full experience he was going to put into the public record before he died. He has indicated, in several recent interviews, that the decision to speak more directly about the anomalous elements of his Apollo 16 experience was connected to his awareness that the living record of the Apollo era is closing fast. Of the 12 men who walked on the moon, only 4 remain alive as of 2026: Duke, Harrison Schmitt, David Scott, and Buzz Aldrin. The physical record of what those men actually experienced, as opposed to the institutional record of what NASA officially reported, exists only as long as they do. That awareness carries a specific kind of urgency in Duke's recent interviews. He is not performing revelation. He is not building toward a book deal or a commercial documentary. He is, by all observable evidence, a man in his late 80s who has decided that the distance between the official account and his actual experience is something the historical record should contain, even if he cannot fully explain what that distance means. He said in one recent conversation, reportedly to a small gathering at a ministry event in Texas, that the thing that stayed with him most about the moon was not the beauty of it, though he has spoken about that beauty many times and with evident sincerity, but the silence from the other end of his radio at the moment when he needed his colleagues on Earth to tell him what he was looking at. He described it as the most alone he has ever felt, not the physical isolation of standing on another world with Earth below the horizon, though that was profound. The aloneness of asking a question and having the people who knew the answer decide not to give it to him That is not the testimony of a man who saw something that frightened him and then built it into something larger over decades of telling. That is the testimony of a man who saw something he did not understand, reported it through proper channels, received a response that communicated more than the words said, and then spent the following 50 years carrying both the observation and the institutional response to it as a quiet, unresolved weight. It does not tell us what the formation in the crater wall was. It does not confirm or refute any of the larger theories about what Apollo astronauts encountered on the lunar surface. What it does, without ambiguity, is establish that the official story of Apollo 16, and by extension the official account of why we have never returned, is incomplete. Not fabricated, not inverted, incomplete. There are pieces of it that the people who were there have not yet fully put into the public record, and pieces that may never be recoverable, because the internal documents from that period were managed with a discretion that 50 years of public records requests have only partially penetrated. The moon, at this moment, is the subject of renewed international attention, unlike anything since the early 1970s. China's Chang'e program is advancing methodically. NASA's Artemis program, battered by delays and budget constraints that would have been familiar to any NASA administrator from the Nixon era, is still nominally on track to land humans on the lunar surface at some point in the second half of this decade. India's Chandrayaan-3 mission successfully soft-landed near the lunar South Pole in August 2023, making India the fourth nation to achieve a soft landing on the moon and the first to touch down near the pole. Commercial entities including SpaceX and Astrobotic are now part of the conversation in ways that were unimaginable in 1972. The lunar South Pole, with its permanently shadowed craters and suspected water ice deposits, has become the primary target of the next phase of exploration. What Charles Duke's testimony adds to that renewed conversation is not a reason to fear the moon. It is a reminder that the 12 human beings who have actually been there did not all bring back the same experience that the official record describes. They brought back something more complicated, more ambiguous, and in some cases, more difficult to file away. The institution that sent them, for reasons that were partly administrative and partly something harder to name, chose to frame the public account of those experiences in terms of what was scientifically manageable and politically presentable, rather than in terms of what was fully true. Duke is not asking anyone to accept a specific theory about what he saw. He is asking, in the careful and restrained language of a man who spent his professional life in environments where precision mattered more than emotion, for the record to include the full account of what he observed and what happened when he reported it. He is 89 years old. He is one of 4 people alive today who have walked on the surface of another world. And he is saying, with the quiet certainty of someone who has had 50 years to weigh the evidence, that there is a reason we did not go back. Not just the budget figures. Not just the shifting political priorities. Something specific was encountered, reported, and then absorbed into the institutional silence of an agency that had decided, at some level, and by someone with the authority to decide, that the complete story of Apollo was not the story the world was going to be told,